updated for the MS-102 skills, measured as of April 28, 2026. This MS-102 practice exam contains 45 expert-level questions. Read each scenario paragraph first, isolate the operational constraints, and choose the answer that satisfies every requirement. After the options, you will hear, "Lock in your answer." Then you get exactly 3 seconds of silence. Pause if you need more time. The reveal includes the complete correct answer, a concise explanation, and the full exam clue. Linked case context is read once and remains visible for its 3-question packet. Question 1 of 45. A high-impact recommendation covers managed corporate Windows devices and contractor-owned discovered devices. Contoso will upgrade its managed devices through Intune. Suppliers must remediate their own devices. The analyst must preserve linked evidence without enrolling contractor devices or misclassifying their exposure. Which response best preserves scope and ownership? Option A. Create an Intune-backed remediation request scoped to the managed device group. Open a supplier remediation ticket for contractor devices and cross-reference it in the remediation notes. Option B. Resolve the recommendation after the corporate deployment and use Defender XDR incident comments as the only record of the still exposed contractor devices. Option C. Create one Intune remediation request for every exposed device and let Intune silently omit the discovered contractor devices. Option D. Create a vulnerability exception for all contractor devices and mark the reason as a false positive, because Contoso cannot deploy software to them. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Create an Intune-backed remediation request scoped to the managed device group. Open a supplier remediation ticket for contractor devices and cross-reference it in the remediation notes. Defender Vulnerability Management can create and track an Intune-backed remediation request for devices Contoso manages. Contractor devices remain visible exposure but aren't valid Intune execution targets. The supplier obligation should remain a separately owned remediation record, cross-referenced in the Defender remediation notes, without inventing a native alternate remediation subpath or falsely classifying the exposure as an exception. When one recommendation spans different management authorities, split execution scope without splitting the evidence trail. Use Intune for managed devices and alternate remediation for work owned outside Intune. Reserve exceptions for an approved risk disposition. Question 2 of 45. A security architect connects Microsoft 365 to Defender for Cloud Apps and selects Microsoft Defender XDR as a component. The connection test succeeds, yet Defender for Cloud Apps does not show Microsoft Defender for Endpoint device signals. Evidence shows that Defender for Endpoint is fully deployed and the same devices are visible in the Defender portal. Change control prohibits rebuilding the working Microsoft 365 connector, and the architect must avoid granting a connector account broader directory roles. What should the architect verify next? Option A. Delete and recreate the Microsoft 365 connector by using a permanent global administrator account, so device records can be read from Microsoft Graph. Option B. Verify that the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration is enabled in Defender for Cloud App settings, and retain the existing Microsoft 365 connector. Option C. Deploy Cloud Discovery log collectors to every corporate egress point, because Microsoft Defender for Endpoint cannot supply device context to Defender for Cloud Apps. Option D. Enable file monitoring on the Microsoft 365 connector, because the Files page is the ingestion source for endpoint device signals. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Verify that the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint integration is enabled in Defender for Cloud App settings, and retain the existing Microsoft 365 connector. The Microsoft 365 App Connector and the Defender for Endpoint integration are separate dependencies. Selecting the Microsoft Defender XDR component during Microsoft 365 connection does not itself enable Defender for Endpoint signal integration in Defender for Cloud Apps. Because the connector test and endpoint deployment already succeed, the narrow next step is to verify the dedicated Defender for Endpoint integration setting while preserving the working connector and its least privilege authorization. File monitoring supplies connected app file inventory, and Cloud Discovery log collection supplies traffic-based app discovery. Neither is the device signal integration described in the evidence. Treat a connected app's components as coverage selectors, not proof that every named service integration is enabled. A healthy Microsoft 365 connector can coexist with a disabled Defender for Endpoint integration. Question 3 of 45. After an acquisition, Litware must update the organization name, address, technical contact, and preferred language that Microsoft uses for tenant-level business communications. The change must not rename the existing onmicrosoft.com domain, alter users' usage location values, or change the language of each user's Microsoft 365 experience. The administrator also wants an auditable before and after record, and must avoid making unrelated branding or release ring changes. Which action should the administrator take? Option A. Export the current tenant details, edit settings, org settings, organization profile, organization information, save the approved business contact and preferred language changes, and retain the export with the change record. Option B. Bulk update every user's usage location and preferred language because those user properties are the authoritative source for tenant business communications. Option C. Edit the Microsoft 365 custom theme and release preferences because the theme's organization name and release ring control Microsoft's tenant-level correspondence. Option D. Rename the initial onmicrosoft.com domain and allow the new domain name to propagate the organization profile, contact, and language values. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Export the current tenant details, edit settings, org settings, organization profile, organization information, save the approved business contact and preferred language changes, and retain the export with the change record. Organization information is the narrow organization profile surface for tenant business identity and Microsoft-facing contact details, including the organization's preferred language for communications. Capturing the existing values before saving provides the requested change evidence. These profile edits do not rename the tenant's initial domain, rewrite user usage locations, or set each user's display language. Custom themes govern user-facing branding, while release preferences govern service feature rollout. Changing either would cross the scenario's explicit scope boundary. Separate tenant business metadata from namespaces, per user locale, and visual branding. Organization information changes who the tenant says it is to Microsoft without rewriting identity or experience settings. Question 4 of 45. Sign-in logs show that attackers are persuading employees to enter Microsoft device codes supplied by the attackers, allowing tokens to be issued to a command line client. Contoso must block device code flow for workforce users across cloud resources, but a separate, approved cross-device authentication transfer used by managed mobile experiences must remain available. 2 emergency access accounts must remain recoverable, and the team requires observed impact evidence before enforcement. Which conditional access plan meets the requirements? Option A. Block the mobile apps and desktop clients client app condition and exclude Microsoft Graph so managed authentication transfer can continue. Option B. Select both device code flow and authentication transfer in one blocking policy because the 2 flows are inseparable whenever a device code appears in sign-in evidence. Option C. Disable device code flow separately on every enterprise application and use the Conditional Access What-If tool as the only evidence before production enforcement. Option D. Target workforce users and all resources. Exclude the emergency accounts. Block device code flow under authentication flows. Run the policy in report-only mode. Review sign-in results, and then enable it. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Target workforce users and all resources, exclude the emergency accounts, block device code flow under authentication flows, run the policy in report-only mode, review sign-in results, and then enable it. Conditional access exposes device code flow and authentication transfer as distinct selections under the authentication flows condition. A blocking policy can therefore target device code flow across resources without also selecting and blocking authentication transfer. Broad workforce and resource scope addresses the token acquisition path rather than one application, while emergency access exclusions preserve recovery. Report-only deployment produces real sign-in impact evidence before the policy is turned on. A client app category is broader than the malicious flow, and excluding a resource would create a token target gap. When the evidence names how a token was obtained, scope on authentication flows rather than broad client categories. Device code and authentication transfer are separate switches, so select only the risky flow. Question 5 of 45. A report-only conditional access policy targets a browser-based finance app. Access must be granted when a finance user either uses a compliant device or satisfies the approved phishing-resistant authentication strength. Both grant controls are selected, but require all the selected controls blocks compliant device users who lack the stronger method. Emergency accounts are already excluded. Which two independent changes implement and enforce the intended policy? Choose two. Option A. Remove the compliant device control and require only the phishing-resistant authentication strength for every finance user. Option B. Change the multiple controls operator from require all the selected controls to require one of the selected controls. Option C. Keep both grant controls and add sign-in frequency every time, so a new prompt can convert the AND relationship into an OR relationship. Option D. Remove the emergency access exclusions before enabling the policy, so all targeted users are evaluated by identical recovery controls. Option E. After confirming the final scope and grant logic against the pilot evidence, change the policy state from report only to on. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and E. Option B. Change the multiple controls operator from require all the selected controls to require one of the selected controls. Option E. After confirming the final scope and grant logic against the pilot evidence, change the policy state from report only to on. The selected grant controls already represent the two approved access paths. The multiple controls operator determines whether they are cumulative or alternative. Changing require all to require one implements the required compliant device or phishing-resistant strength decision without weakening either path into ordinary MFA. Once the corrected scope and logic are checked against the pilot evidence, changing the policy from report only to on begins enforcement. These actions are unordered. One corrects grant evaluation and the other changes policy state. The emergency access exclusions remain a recovery dependency and are not removed merely for policy symmetry. Read the grant control operator as Boolean logic. Selected controls plus require all means and, while require one means or. Policy state controls enforcement and cannot repair incorrect logic. Question 6 of 45. Contoso must replace push-based MFA with phishing-resistant MFA for members of 3 privileged Microsoft Entra role groups when they access Microsoft admin portals. Sign-in evidence shows that several administrators have not yet registered an authentication method allowed by the built-in phishing-resistant MFA authentication strength. The existing conditional access policy that requires MFA for all administrators must remain effective during migration, And 2 monitored emergency access accounts must not be locked out. Security requires evidence of each pilot user's likely result before the stronger control is enforced. Which implementation sequence best meets the requirements? Option A. Enable security defaults for the tenant, exclude the emergency access accounts from security defaults, and disable both conditional access policies after registration is complete. Option B. Replace the existing administrator MFA policy immediately with a new policy that requires the phishing-resistant MFA authentication strength for all administrators, and use authentication method registration after users are blocked. Option C. Register pilot users, require phishing-resistant MFA in a separate report-only pilot policy, exclude emergency accounts, then validate and enable it while retaining broader MFA. Option D. Configure a sign-in frequency of every time on the existing MFA policy, because repeated push approvals are evaluated as phishing-resistant MFA after the user signs in again. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Register pilot users, require phishing-resistant MFA in a separate report-only pilot policy, exclude emergency accounts, then validate and enable it while retaining broader MFA. Authentication strength is the conditional access grant control that constrains which registered method combinations can satisfy MFA. Making an ordinary MFA prompt recur does not change its resistance properties. The allowed methods and pilot registrations are therefore dependencies that should be established before enforcement. A separate, narrowly scoped report-only policy preserves the existing broad MFA control, while sign-in logs expose the stronger policy's report-only result for each pilot sign-in. Excluding the monitored emergency access accounts prevents lockout, and enabling the policy only after evidence review sequences readiness, validation, and enforcement without weakening the current administrator baseline. For an MFA strength migration, sequence method availability and registration before report-only evaluation. Add the stronger scoped grant without removing the existing broad MFA floor, and protect emergency access explicitly. Question 7 of 45. Contoso's operations platform must correlate tenant-specific Microsoft 365 incidents with internal network telemetry. The platform needs a scheduled, app-only retrieval of current and historical service health issues, and must store each issue ID, affected service, status, and update history as evidence. The application must not receive permission to change users, groups, or tenant settings. Human responders also need service health email notifications for Exchange Online and Microsoft Teams incidents, but not Message Center feature announcements. Which design should the Microsoft 365 administrator implement? Option A. Assign Global Reader to an interactive operations account. Store its password in the platform, and scrape the Microsoft 365 Admin Center Service Health page whenever an email arrives. Option B. Configure Message Center Digest emails for Exchange and Teams. Then grant the application directory.read all so it can infer incidents from tenant audit logs. Option C. Use only Azure Service Health alerts and query Azure Resource Health, because Microsoft 365 tenant incidents are represented as Azure resources with the same issue IDs. Option D. Configure Service Health email for Exchange Online and Teams. Give the app servicehealth.readAll application permission and schedule Microsoft Graph service communications retrieval. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Configure Service Health email for Exchange Online and Teams. Give the app servicehealth.read.all application permission and schedule Microsoft Graph service communications retrieval. Service Health is the tenant-scoped source for active incidents and advisories, and its email preferences provide service and issue type filtering for human responders. The Microsoft Graph Service Communications API supplies machine-readable service announcements and issue updates, including identifiers and status information that the platform can preserve and correlate. servicehealth.readAll is the least privileged application permission for reading that service health data. It does not confer directory write access. Combining scoped service health email with scheduled graph retrieval satisfies both audiences without confusing operational incidents with message center change communications or Azure Resource Health. Separate service health delivery from evidence ingestion. Scoped admin center email serves people, while app-only graph service communications with service health. Read All serves a correlation system. Message Center and Azure Health are different planes. Question 8 of 45. After a consent phishing incident, Contoso discovers a Microsoft Entra OAuth app that requests high-impact delegated permissions and has very low tenant usage. Security wants Defender for Cloud Apps to continuously identify OAuth apps meeting those risk characteristics, generate an alert for analyst evidence review, and prevent further access by a confirmed malicious app without suspending every user who granted consent. The control must operate on app permissions and consent, not on individual file activities. Which policy and response design best fits the requirement? Option A. Create a Cloud Discovery app tag policy that marks the OAuth app as unsanctioned and rely on the tag alone to revoke existing Microsoft Entra consent grants and tokens. Option B. Create an OAuth app policy for the stated permission and usage risks, alert on matches, review the app and grants, and ban the confirmed malicious app. Option C. Create a file policy for documents owned by consenting users and apply a governance action that removes public links from every matching file. Option D. Create an activity policy that alerts on one consent event, then suspend all users associated with the app, because user suspension is the only way to revoke an OAuth application's access. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create an OAuth app policy for the stated permission and usage risks, alert on matches, review the app and grants, and ban the confirmed malicious app. An OAuth app policy evaluates an application's permissions, consent, and usage characteristics, which is the control layer described by the evidence. It can continuously surface apps that match the risk criteria and trigger alerts for review. After the app identity and grants are confirmed malicious, banning the app targets the compromised application access path, rather than disabling all consenting users. File and activity policies inspect different entities, while a Cloud Discovery sanction tag classifies discovered cloud app use and does not by itself revoke an OAuth app's existing consent-based access. When the risky entity is an app's consent and permissions, use an OAuth app policy and contain the app itself. File policies, user suspension, and discovery sanction tags act on adjacent but different control planes. Question 9 of 45. Contoso stores board papers in SharePoint Online and OneDrive and applies the sensitivity label Board Highly Confidential. Authorized directors must retain normal permissions to open the labeled files. However, Microsoft 365 Copilot must not use those files to ground responses or summarize their contents, even for a director who can open the source file. Existing Exchange, Teams, and Endpoint DLP rules must remain unchanged, and the compliance team wants policy match evidence before enforcement. Which implementation best meets the requirement? Option A. Add the Microsoft 365 Copilot location to the existing Endpoint DLP policy and block clipboard operations for the Board Highly Confidential label. Option B. Create a Copilot scoped DLP policy for the Board Highly Confidential label, validate it in simulation, then enable it without changing source permissions. Option C. Remove directors' SharePoint and OneDrive permissions to every labeled file, because Copilot can process only content that no user can access. Option D. Create a SharePoint retention label that declares each board paper a record, because record locking prevents Copilot from grounding on content while preserving directors' read access. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create a Copilot scoped DLP policy for the board highly confidential label. Validate it in simulation, then enable it without changing source permissions. The Microsoft 365 Copilot DLP location provides a processing boundary separate from a user's source authorization. A policy can use a sensitivity label condition for files stored in SharePoint Online or OneDrive and restrict Copilot from processing matching content, while the authorized user's ability to open the file remains governed by the workload's permissions. Scoping a new policy to the Copilot location avoids changing unrelated Exchange, Teams, and endpoint actions. Simulation mode supplies match evidence before enforcement, preserving the required sequence and limiting disruption. Distinguish source authorization from AI processing. A Copilot location DLP rule can exclude labeled SharePoint or OneDrive content from grounding, while authorized users retain direct access. Simulate before enforcing. Tailspin Toys routes Microsoft 365 traffic from its Madrid office through a newly deployed secure web gateway in Dublin. On the same day, the company begins preparing a previously unsynchronized Madrid ADDS domain for Microsoft Entra synchronization. Defender for Cloud Apps receives Microsoft 365 activities through its app connector. A Defender XDR incident reports possible SharePoint data collection by a Madrid project manager, but the response lead will not authorize session revocation until the cloud activity, network path, and identity ownership are distinguished. Question 10 of 45. The incident identifies a 2-hour window and a project site. In the Defender for Cloud Apps activity log, several download file events have the manager's display name, but only some involve the project site. Investigators must preserve a reproducible event set and determine whether those downloads share the secure web gateway's egress address and client characteristics before containment. Which two actions should the investigators take in the activity log? Choose two. Option A. Open the matching activity records and compare their source IP address, location, user agent, device details, and raw activity data with the gateway and endpoint evidence. Option B. Use the activity log's IP address category to prove which physical workstation performed each download without consulting endpoint or gateway records. Option C. Filter only on the manager's display name, then treat every returned Microsoft 365 activity as part of the incident because the app connector already correlated the identity. Option D. Filter activities by the manager, SharePoint Online, download file, the project site object, and the incident time range, and export the resulting activity set. Option E. Create an activity policy for download file and use its first alert count as the historical total for the 2-hour window. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and D. Option A. Open the matching activity records and compare their source IP address, location, user agent, device details, and raw activity data with the gateway and endpoint evidence. Option D. Filter activities by the manager, SharePoint Online, download file, the project site object, and the incident time range, and export the resulting activity set. The defensible sequence is to scope the evidence set before interpreting individual records, filtering on actor, connected app, activity type, affected object, and time range excludes unrelated actions performed by the same identity, while exporting preserves the reproducible set used for the decision. The activity drawer then provides the source IP and other contextual fields needed to compare the downloads with the known Dublin Gateway egress and endpoint evidence. A shared gateway IP is network path evidence, not proof of a particular physical device. So client and raw event details must be correlated rather than inferred. The two selections are independent and unordered. In a Defender for Cloud Apps investigation, first make the activity set reproducible with actor plus app plus action plus object plus time filters. Then treat IP and client fields as correlation evidence, not automatic device attribution. Question 11 of 45. Network Connectivity Insights correctly associates client samples with the Madrid office by LAN subnet. The assessment declined immediately after the gateway rollout and shows Madrid traffic reaching Microsoft 365 through a service front door near Dublin. Service health is normal, and unmanaged home users in Spain are unaffected. Security requires web inspection to remain enabled, but permits a Madrid local gateway node and local DNS resolution for Microsoft 365 destinations. Which action sequence best validates the dependency and improves connectivity without weakening the inspection requirement? Option A. Open a Microsoft 365 Service Health incident, retain Dublin backhaul, and exclude SharePoint from Defender for Cloud Apps monitoring until the tenant assessment improves. Option B. Replace the Madrid LAN subnet with the gateway's Dublin egress IP as the office definition. Then disable TLS inspection for all internet traffic, so every Microsoft 365 connection is direct. Option C. Run the connectivity test from a managed Madrid client. Move inspected Microsoft 365 egress to the Madrid local gateway with local DNS. Then review the assessment after new samples accumulate. Option D. Delete the Madrid LAN subnet definition. Wait for clients to be grouped by the Dublin public IP address and compare Madrid with the Dublin office. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Run the connectivity test from a managed Madrid client. Move inspected Microsoft 365 egress to the Madrid local gateway with local DNS. Then review the assessment after new samples accumulate. The Office association is already correct, so changing its definition would conceal rather than fix the path problem. An endpoint run connectivity test supplies current DNS, egress, and service front door evidence from inside Madrid. That evidence can validate the backhaul dependency before the approved design change. Using a Madrid local inspection node and local DNS preserves the required security control while reducing geographic hairpinning. Network Connectivity Insights can then confirm the effect after sufficient new client measurements arrive. This sequence separates measurement, scoped remediation, and post-change verification. When insights already identify the right office, but expose a distant front door, preserve the location definition, prove DNS and egress from an in-office endpoint, make the narrow path change, and wait for fresh samples before judging the new assessment. Question 12 of 45. The Madrid ADDS domain has not yet synchronized. An IDFix query returns no errors for manager Elena Ruiz. However, the Defender for Cloud Apps investigation resolves Elena to an existing cloud-only account, whose verified domain, user principal name, and primary SMTP address equal Elena's planned ADDS values. The cloud account owns the project site's files and must be retained. The directory team has not approved a source anchor or matching decision, and no synchronization export is authorized until object ownership is resolved. What should the identity team do next? Option A. Enable soft matching without documenting the cloud account, because matching by UPN and primary SMTP address is an IDFix remediation operation. Option B. Treat the clean IDFix result as proof that Elena will become a new synchronized object. Enable synchronization and merge any duplicate objects afterward. Option C. Keep IDFix as hygiene evidence. Inventory the cloud account and resources, pilot the intended match and source anchor, then authorize broader synchronization. Option D. Delete the cloud-only account, run IDFix execute with no edited rows, and restore the project site ownership after the synchronized account is created. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Keep IDFix as hygiene evidence. Inventory the cloud account and resources, pilot the intended match and source anchor, then authorize broader synchronization. IDFix evaluates supported attributes in the on-premises directory for formatting and duplication conditions that can impede synchronization. A clean query does not inventory Microsoft Entra cloud-only objects. Guarantee that a new object will be created or authorize a match. Here, the matching cloud values and retained SharePoint ownership create a separate object join and authority decision. The team should preserve the clean directory hygiene evidence, inventory the cloud identity and dependencies, establish the intended immutable/source anchor and matching outcome, prove it with a tightly scoped pilot, and only then expand synchronization. This prevents both an unintended join and a duplicate that could fracture ownership. A clean ID fix query proves only the supported on-premises hygiene checks it performed. Cloud object inventory, source anchor planning, and match validation remain separate gates before first export. Question 13 of 45. Contoso is moving current channel devices from decentralized Office deployment tool schedules to Cloud Update in the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center. Inventory already reports the devices. A regulated laboratory group must remain under its validated Configuration Manager update workflow, while every other eligible current channel device, including devices added later, must be brought under Cloud Update Management. Operations needs rollout and failure evidence from the same admin center plane and must avoid maintaining an inclusion list that can omit new devices. Which configuration should the administrator use? Option A. Create an inclusion group containing all currently inventoried devices and leave the current channel profile disabled, because inventory reporting alone applies cloud update policies to group members. Option B. Change the regulated laboratory devices to monthly enterprise channel, enable cloud update for both channels, and use a longer deadline as a substitute for their configuration manager workflow. Option C. Enable the current channel cloud update profile for the tenant, add the regulated laboratory group as an exclusion, configure the profile's rollout settings, and monitor deployment validation and device status in the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center. Option D. Enable the current channel profile without exclusions, then configure Configuration Manager to overwrite cloud update settings on laboratory devices whenever the two management planes conflict. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Enable the current channel cloud update profile for the tenant, add the regulated laboratory group as an exclusion, configure the profile's rollout settings, and monitor deployment validation and device status in the Microsoft 365 Apps Admin Center. A cloud update profile is enabled by Update Channel and is designed to bring eligible devices on that channel under management, including devices that become eligible later. An exclusion is therefore the narrow way to preserve the laboratory group's separate validated management dependency without converting the general population into a fragile point-in-time inclusion list. The profile supplies rollout controls and admin center reporting for deployment progress, validation, and device-level issues. Explicitly separating the laboratory devices also avoids two update authorities competing over the same clients. Cloud Update's durable scope is channel-wide eligibility, with explicit exceptions. Enable the channel profile, exclude devices owned by another validated authority, and use admin center status rather than treating inventory as enforcement. Question 14 of 45. Fabricam is piloting migration of one ADDSOU from Microsoft Entra Connect Sync to Microsoft Entra Cloud Sync. The OU contains users who are members of security groups that remain under Connect Sync, and manager relationships cross the pilot boundary. During coexistence, Operations removes the pilot OU from Connect Sync filtering as soon as Cloud Sync provisions its first user. The next Connect Sync export proposes widespread group membership and manager reference removals, although the source relationships still exist. Accidental deletion protection stops the export. Which recovery and migration sequence preserves references and establishes a defensible authority handoff? Option A. Delete and recreate the affected groups as cloud-only groups. Then run Cloud Sync on demand for one user to prove that all group and manager references across the OU boundary are repaired. Option B. Return the OU to Connect Sync scope and run a full synchronization to rebuild references. Keep related objects in scope during the documented pilot. verify Cloud Sync provisioning and references, and remove Connect Sync scope only after handoff. Option C, put the active Connect Sync server in staging mode permanently. Leave the pilot OU excluded, and promote a second Connect Sync server to export the pending reference deletions before Cloud Sync resumes. Option D, disable accidental deletion protection. Export the reference removals, and rely on the next Cloud Sync cycle to reconstruct every cross-scope relationship. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Return the OU to Connect Sync scope and run a full synchronization to rebuild references. Keep related objects in scope during the documented pilot. Verify Cloud Sync provisioning and references, and remove Connect Sync scope only after handoff. Removing an object from Connect Sync scope removes its connector space and metaverse representation. References to or from that object can then be dropped and exported as reference deletions. The safeguard has prevented those unintended changes. Reintroducing the OU and performing a full synchronization rebuilds the reference state. During a supported pilot, objects and both sides of cross-scope references remain in Connect Sync scope, while custom pilot rules suppress the appropriate non-reference exports. The team then verifies that Cloud Sync provisions the full intended population and preserves memberships and manager links before removing the completed scope from Connect Sync. Authority is transferred only after evidence, not at the first successful object provision. In a Connect Sync to Cloud Sync pilot, coexistence is not achieved by filtering the pilot objects out of Connect Sync early. Preserve connector space references until Cloud Sync authority and both sides of every relationship are verified. Question 15 of 45. A tenant adoption board rejects license assignment as proof of use and requires 3 independently reproducible findings from Microsoft 365 Admin Center usage reports. The analyst must identify which client families users employ to access Exchange Online, compare distinct active users across Microsoft 365 services over the selected period, and determine which SharePoint sites have both low file activity and high storage consumption before an archival review. The analyst has Reports Reader and will export each selected report. No tenant configuration change is authorized. Match each evidence requirement to the most specific usage report. Each target may be used once. Some targets are not used. Requirements. R1. Identify the Exchange client applications used by each user, including mobile, desktop, and web client families. R2. Compare active user counts and per-user last activity evidence across Microsoft 365 services for the reporting period. R3. Compare SharePoint site storage with files viewed, edited, synchronized, or shared to select sites for archival review. Targets. T1. Microsoft 365 Apps Usage Report. T2. SharePoint Site Usage Report. T3. Email App Usage Report. T4. Microsoft Teams Device Usage Report. T5. Microsoft 365 Apps Active Users Report. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T3. Identify the Exchange client applications used by each user, including mobile, desktop, and web client families. Maps to Email App Usage Report. R2 maps to T5. Compare active user counts and per-user last activity evidence across Microsoft 365 services for the reporting period. Maps to Microsoft 365 Apps Active Users Report. R3 maps to T2. Compare SharePoint site storage with files viewed, edited, synchronized, or shared to select sites for archival review. Maps to SharePoint Site Usage Report. The Email App Usage Report answers the client question by showing which Exchange email applications each user used. The Microsoft 365 Apps Active Users Report is the cross-service adoption view. It exposes active users and last activity information across included Microsoft 365 services for the selected period. The SharePoint Site Usage Report is site-scoped and combines storage with file and sharing activity, allowing the board to identify high-storage, low-activity sites for a separate archival decision. Reports Reader provides reporting access without tenant configuration authority, and exporting each narrow report preserves the evidence layers rather than collapsing them into licensing or an aggregate adoption score.
Start with the evidence grain. Exchange client family points to email app usage. Cross-service user activity points to active users. And storage plus content actions at site grain points to SharePoint site usage.
Question 16 of 45. Contoso must add continuous cloud discovery for traffic that exits through a supported firewall in a restricted data center. A hardened Linux host can receive syslog from the firewall and initiate HTTPS connections to Microsoft, but the firewall cannot connect to the internet. Before operations authorizes continuous forwarding, the security architect must prove that the selected log format maps users, source IP addresses, destinations, and traffic volumes correctly. The proof must not be mistaken for ongoing coverage, and no inbound internet connection may be opened. Which implementation sequence meets the requirements?
Option A. Enable the Defender for Endpoint integration on the Linux collector host and treat its local endpoint telemetry as discovery coverage for every device whose traffic crosses the firewall. Option B. Validate a representative log with a snapshot report. Then define the data source, send firewall syslog to a Linux log collector, and permit the collector's outbound connection to Defender for Cloud apps. Option C. Configure the firewall to upload logs directly to Defender for Cloud apps over an inbound connection to the data center, and use the first continuous report as the parser test. Option D. Upload a representative log as a snapshot report, and retain that report as the continuous data source, because validated snapshots automatically ingest later syslog messages. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Validate a representative log with a snapshot report. Then define the data source, send firewall syslog to a Linux log collector, and permit the collector's outbound connection to Defender for Cloud apps. A snapshot upload is the narrow pre-production test for a representative set of traffic logs. It proves that the chosen format is accepted and that the resulting discovery fields are usable. It does not establish recurring ingestion. Continuous discovery from a supported perimeter device requires a configured data source and a log collector. The firewall sends syslog locally to the collector, while the collector initiates the permitted outbound connection to Defender for Cloud apps. This sequence separates parser evidence from the production dependency and avoids granting the firewall or an external service an inbound path into the data center. Defender for Endpoint Discovery is useful for onboarded endpoints, but telemetry from the collector host cannot stand in for all clients represented in firewall logs. When cloud discovery must be proven before a restricted network rollout, use a snapshot to validate parsing. Then build continuous ingestion as firewall to local collector plus collector to cloud. Validation evidence and recurring transport are separate layers. Question 17 of 45. Endpoint DLP already blocks printing regulated design files from onboarded Windows devices. Engineering now has an approved secure print queue, while all other corporate and home printers must remain blocked for those files. The queue is deployed through the existing print service, and its stable printer properties are known. The compliance team must preserve one content rule, avoid user-based exceptions, and produce evidence that the exception follows the destination printer rather than the user's location or device. What should the administrator configure? Option A. Add the print spool folder to endpoint DLP file path exclusions, so files sent through the approved queue are not inspected, while retaining the global print block. Option B. Add the engineers to an unrestricted user group and exclude that group from endpoint DLP whenever the approved queue is installed on their device. Option C. Create an allowed removable storage group for the print server and rely on its serial number to identify jobs sent to the approved printer queue. Option D.
Define the approved queue as an endpoint DLP printer group, allow that group while blocking other printers, and validate both paths in simulation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Define the approved queue as an endpoint DLP printer group, allow that group while blocking other printers, and validate both paths in simulation. Endpoint DLP printer groups classify print destinations by supported printer properties, and let a rule apply a different action to a named group than to other printers. Defining the approved queue as a printer group, allowing that group, and retaining the broader block makes the exception destination bound, while preserving one sensitive content rule. Simulation provides event evidence for the allowed and blocked paths before enforcement. A user exclusion would travel with the engineer to unapproved printers, and a path exclusion would remove files in that path from monitoring and policy enforcement, rather than express a print destination exception. Removable storage groups classify USB devices, not printer queues or print servers. Bind an endpoint DLP exception to the object that owns the business exception. Printer groups for approved print destinations, removable storage groups for approved media, and user scope, only when the person, not the destination, is the intended exception. Question 18 of 45. A DLP investigator can open a high-severity alert and review its policy, user, device, action, and associated events. To decide whether the match is a true disclosure, the investigator must inspect the matched sensitive content and surrounding context for one event. The organization does not permit global administrator or broad compliance administrator assignments, and the investigator must not receive authority to edit DLP policies. The case owner will record the disposition only after the content evidence is reviewed. Which access and investigation sequence best satisfies least privilege and preserves the evidence boundary? Option A, assign compliance administrator. Export the entire DLP report and infer the matched content from the policy name before closing the alert. Option B, assign Content Explorer List Viewer only, because permission to list classified items automatically grants visibility into matched sensitive content and contextual text in DLP events. Option C, add Content Explorer Content Viewer. Retain DLP investigation access. Inspect the alert event's matched content and context, and document the disposition. Option D, give the investigator permission to edit the DLP policy. Reproduce the event by weakening the rule, and use the new alert as the content preview for the original event. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Add Content Explorer Content Viewer. Retain DLP investigation access, inspect the alert event's matched content and context, and document the disposition. DLP alert access can expose alert and event metadata without exposing the sensitive text that caused the match. Microsoft documents Content Explorer Content Viewer, which includes the Data Classification Content Viewer role, as the additional permission required for matched sensitive content and context. Retaining the investigator's existing DLP access and adding this focused viewer role separates evidence visibility from policy administration. The investigator should then move from the alert to the exact event, review its protected content evidence, and only afterward record the case disposition. A report or policy title cannot establish the actual matched content, and changing the policy to recreate an event damages scope and does not prove what the original event contained. If DLP metadata is visible, but the decisive matched text is hidden, diagnose a content visibility role boundary, not a missing event. Content Explorer Content Viewer exposes protected evidence without granting policy edit authority. Question 19 of 45. Microsoft 365 Backup protects a SharePoint engineering site. An automated process overwrote 18 known files in 2 libraries yesterday, but investigation confirms that the rest of the site, its permissions, and newer legitimate content are healthy. Legal requires recovery from a pre-overwrite restore point without rolling the entire site back or creating a parallel site URL. The recovery operator must first verify the selected versions and then preserve task-level evidence of completion. The recovery operator has the SharePoint backup admin role. Which recovery plan best meets the requirements?
Option A. Restore the entire protected site to a new URL. Manually copy the 18 files back and treat creation of the new site as proof that each required file version was recovered. Option B. Run an express full site restore to the original URL, because Express Restore is the only Microsoft 365 backup operation that can replace file content in place. Option C. Choose the latest available restore point after the overwrite, so unchanged site metadata is preserved, and rely on Microsoft Purview retention to select the earlier versions during the backup task. Option D. Select a pre-overwrite restore point and only the affected files. Review the items and time, restore them in place, and monitor the task to completion. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Select a pre-overwrite restore point and only the affected files, review the items and time, restore them in place, and monitor the task to completion. Microsoft 365 Backup supports granular recovery for protected SharePoint sites, allowing an administrator to browse or search restore points and recover selected files or folders, rather than reverting the full site. Selecting a point before the overwrite and restoring only the 18 known files to their original locations satisfies the legal scope while retaining healthy site state and the existing URL. Reviewing the chosen content and point in time before submission addresses version evidence, and the restoration task record provides operational status and completion evidence. Express Restore optimizes a broad site or account recovery. It is not required for item-level in-place recovery. Purview retention is a separate governance mechanism and does not cause a backup task aimed at a post-incident point to substitute older file versions. Granular SharePoint Restore requires SharePoint Backup Admin. This workflow does not require Global Administrator. Choose Microsoft 365 Backup Restore Scope before choosing speed or destination. Known files plus a healthy surrounding site points to granular item recovery. Broad corruption and an accepted rollback point to full site or express recovery. Question 20 of 45. Cloud Discovery must identify an app that lacks required SOC 2 assurance and encryption at rest, exceeds 50 users and 100 transactions, and reveal its users and source IPs. Operations also needs a reusable alert for future discovery data meeting the same conditions. Blocking is out of scope. Which two independent actions should the analyst take? Choose two. Option A. Create an activity policy for file downloads in connected apps and treat its alerts as continuous cloud discovery traffic volume findings. Option B. Create an app discovery policy with the same risk factor and usage thresholds. Configure an alert, and use it to detect later qualifying discovery data. Option C. Use the Cloud Discovery Dashboard's headquarters map as proof of each user's network source, and omit the app details user and source IP evidence. Option D. On the Discovered Apps page, filter the catalog and usage data by the stated compliance, security, user, and transaction conditions. Open the resulting app to review its users and source IP addresses. Option E. Mark every app with a catalog score of 6 or lower as unsanctioned, and push a block before reviewing tenant usage or application ownership. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are B and D. Option B. Create an app discovery policy with the same risk factor and usage thresholds, configure an alert, and use it to detect later qualifying discovery data. Option D. On the Discovered Apps page, filter the catalog and usage data by the stated compliance, security, user, and transaction conditions.
Open the resulting app to review its users and source IP addresses. The Discovered Apps view can combine app catalog risk factors with tenant-specific usage thresholds, narrowing the review to services that fail the required assurance and encryption criteria while actually exceeding Contoso's adoption threshold. Opening the selected app exposes the affected users and source IP addresses needed for ownership and network path investigation. An app discovery policy expresses those same discovery conditions as reusable detection and can generate alerts as later log data qualifies. These actions are unordered. One investigates current discovery evidence, and the other establishes future detection. Neither action prejudges the governance decision or deploys a block. Activity policies operate on activities from connected apps, rather than serving as a replacement for Cloud Discovery's traffic and catalog analysis. And a headquarters map describes app vendor geography rather than user attribution. For a Cloud Discovery issue, combine catalog risk with observed tenant use before disposition. Discovered Apps answers who and from where now, while an app discovery policy turns the same risk plus volume logic into future alerts. Question 21 of 45. A custom sensitive information type must detect an identifier formatted as PAH plus 4 digits, a hyphen, and exactly 10 uppercase hexadecimal characters. A weekly maintained approved phrase must occur within 120 characters, and a phrase alone must never match. Administrators must be able to require additional evidence at higher confidence without changing the identifier expression. Which design meets these requirements? Option A. Create separate keyword-only sensitive information types for the phrases and identifier prefix. Then require both types in the consuming DLP rule, because proximity and confidence are evaluated only by DLP policies. Option B. Make a keyword list containing the approved phrases the primary element. Add the identifier regular expression as optional supporting evidence, and use the DLP policy priority to enforce the 120-character distance. Option C. Use one regular expression that contains every approved phrase and the identifier, then replace and republish the entire sensitive information type whenever the phrase list changes. Option D. Use the bounded identifier regular expression as the primary element. Use a keyword dictionary for the approved phrases as supporting evidence within 120 characters, and define confidence levels that add required corroborating elements while retaining the same primary expression. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Use the bounded identifier regular expression as the primary element. Use a keyword dictionary for the approved phrases as supporting evidence within 120 characters, and define confidence levels that add required corroborating elements while retaining the same primary expression. A custom sensitive information type pattern requires a primary element and can combine it with supporting elements, character proximity, and confidence levels. Making the tightly bounded PAH identifier expression primary ensures that a phrase alone cannot match. A keyword dictionary keeps the changing phrase vocabulary independently maintainable, while the pattern's character proximity binds that evidence to the identifier. Additional required supporting evidence can distinguish higher confidence without duplicating or weakening the primary expression. The consuming DLP policy controls workload scope and response, but it should not be used to reconstruct the sensitive information type's internal evidence relationship. In a custom sensitive information type, make the evidence that must always exist the primary element. Use independently maintainable supporting elements plus character proximity and confidence to express corroboration, rather than rebuilding that relationship in each consuming policy. Question 22 of 45. The board funds a ransomware reduction program, represented by a Microsoft Security Exposure Management initiative. Its score falls after a newly assessed metric becomes unfulfilled, although Microsoft Secure Score rises during the same week because an unrelated identity improvement action was completed. The program owner wants defensible evidence of what changed in the ransomware objective and the narrowest remediation target that will improve that objective. The owner must not treat tenant-wide secure score movement as proof that the initiative improved. What should the exposure management analyst do first?
Option A. Suppress the newly unfulfilled metric as accepted risk before reviewing affected assets so its score no longer obscures the week's secure score gain. Option B. Export secure score history, attribute the identity action's gained points to the ransomware initiative, and close the initiative metric because both scores measure the same controls. Option C. Mark the unrelated secure score improvement action as resolved through a third party so the initiative recalculates against the higher tenant-wide score. Option D. Use the initiative history and metric details to identify the metric whose state changed, inspect its affected assets and linked security recommendation, and create the remediation work item from that recommendation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Use the initiative history and metric details to identify the metric whose state changed, inspect its affected assets and linked security recommendation, and create the remediation work item from that recommendation. An exposure initiative measures progress against the initiative's own security metrics. Its history and metric details provide the evidence for a state change, and the metric leads to affected assets and actionable recommendations. That path preserves the board objective, identifies scope, and creates a remediation record against the control that actually influences the initiative. Microsoft Secure Score remains useful posture evidence, but points gained from an unrelated identity action do not prove that a ransomware initiative metric was fulfilled. Risk acceptance is a governed disposition after analysis, not a device for reconciling two different scoring models. When two posture scores move in opposite directions, follow the objective-specific evidence chain: initiative history, to metric, to affected assets, to recommendation, instead of translating points between scoring systems. Question 23 of 45. A pharmaceutical company must retain each clinical trial document for 15 years, beginning when the applicable trial receives regulatory closure. Documents for many trials share the same SharePoint sites. Closure occurs on different dates, and users must not enter closure dates or relabel documents after closure. Before any trial closes, the records team can create one event type, apply a retention label, whose event identifier records the trial ID, and import the closure event from the validated trial system. The team needs an auditable sequence that prevents an imported event from starting retention on unlabeled content. Which implementation sequence meets the requirement? Option A. Create one event-based label per SharePoint site. Configure retention to begin when content was last modified, and use the closure event only as an audit annotation. Option B. Create a static SharePoint retention policy for 15 years. Import each closure event, and then use the event to change the policy's start date for the matching site. Option C. Create and import the closure event first, then publish a retention label that starts from labeled date, and expect Purview to replay the earlier event against newly labeled content. Option D. Create an event-based label tied to the event type. Publish or auto-apply it with each trial ID as the asset ID. Verify labeling, then create the closure event with the matching type, asset ID, and date. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Create an event-based label tied to the event type. Publish or auto-apply it with each trial ID as the asset ID. Verify labeling, then create the closure event with the matching type, asset ID, and date. Event-based retention is designed for a business event that starts retention at different times for related content. The label is configured to start retention from an event and associated with an event type. Labeled items carry the asset or event identifier, in this scenario, the trial ID, that lets the event select matching content.
Publishing or auto-applying and verifying the label before creating the event establishes the dependency and avoids relying on an event to find content that was not yet labeled. The imported event then supplies the matching event type, asset ID, and event date, so users neither relabel content nor enter dates at closure. For event-driven retention, establish correlation before the trigger. Event-based label plus asset ID on the content first, then an event with the same type and asset ID supplies the business date that starts retention. Question 24 of 45. A Defender XDR incident shows a malicious OAuth application consent followed by mailbox access. Responders suspect that the application later caused a distinctive command line on onboarded endpoints, but the incident currently contains no endpoint alert. The application ID is present in Cloud App Events, while the endpoint evidence would be in Device Process Events. The team needs a recurring alert, only when both observations involve the same user within 30 minutes. Before automation is enabled, analysts must validate the join against historical telemetry and ensure the resulting alert preserves the user and device as impacted entities. Which response sequence best meets the evidence and detection requirements? Option A, create an incident alert suppression rule for the OAuth alert. Wait for endpoint correlation, and then use the suppressed alert count as proof that the command ran. Option B, isolate all devices used by the consenting user before querying. Then correlate any isolation action with the OAuth alert because response actions are equivalent to historical process evidence. Option C, test an advanced hunting query that joins normalized user evidence across both tables within 30 minutes and projects timestamp plus real account and device identifiers. Validate results, then create the custom detection. Option D, create a custom detection from a Cloud App Events only query and add device name as constant text in the alert title so every alert is automatically linked to an endpoint. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Test an advanced hunting query that joins normalized user evidence across both tables within 30 minutes and projects timestamp plus real account and device identifiers. Validate results, then create the custom detection. Advanced hunting is the evidence layer for testing a cross-table hypothesis before operationalizing it. The query must normalize a genuine shared user key and constrain the temporal relationship, rather than assume incident membership proves correlation. A custom detection rule is created from a tested query, and its result schema must retain timestamp and the columns needed to identify impacted entities. Projecting the real user and device identifiers enables alert enrichment and response targeting. This sequence separates historical validation from recurring detection and avoids containment without evidence. Operationalize a hunt only after its join proves the relationship. Normalize a real cross-table key. Bound time, preserve timestamp and entity IDs, validate results, and then convert the query to a custom detection. Contoso gives research partners B2B guest access to a SharePoint workspace. A Defender for Office 365 campaign delivered messages containing a newly registered credential harvesting URL to several partner mailboxes and one Contoso mailbox. One partner guest later accessed the workspace from an unfamiliar network. The SOC must distinguish message disposition, user interaction, identity containment, and external threat intelligence before changing tenant-wide protection. Question 25 of 45. The Defender for Office 365 Threat Protection Status Report shows an increase in phish detections during the campaign window, but its summary does not establish which messages reached a mailbox or whether a recipient selected a rewritten URL. Investigators need reproducible evidence for both claims before scoping identity response. Which two report pivots should the investigators use? Choose two. Option A, filter threat protection status message details by campaign window and phish detection to identify recipients and delivery locations. Option B, Use the Secure Score history graph to infer which recipients clicked the URL from the date on which the phishing score changed. Option C. Use the Mailflow status summary alone and treat every message classified as phish as delivered to the inbox. Option D. Use the Defender for Cloud Apps activity log to infer original message delivery location from the guest's later SharePoint sign-in. Option E. Use the URL protection report's URL click protection details for the campaign window to identify click events and their allowed or blocked outcomes for the rewritten URL. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and E. Option A. Filter threat protection status message details by campaign window and phish detection to identify recipients and delivery locations. Option E. Use the URL protection report's URL click protection details for the campaign window to identify click events and their allowed or blocked outcomes for the rewritten URL. The two claims require different report evidence. Threat protection status message details can be filtered by date, threat type, recipient, and delivery location to establish how matching messages were handled. URL click protection details provide the separate interaction record for safe links processed URLs, including the click and action outcome. Correlating the common URL, recipient, and time window supports identity triage without converting an aggregate trend into a claim about delivery or clicks. The selections are complementary and unordered. Neither report must be opened first, and neither substitutes for the other. When a Defender report raises a campaign issue, separate disposition from interaction. Message-level threat report details prove where mail went, while URL click protection details prove what happened when a rewritten link was selected. Question 26 of 45. Report correlation identifies partner guest Ada Mensa as the only workspace guest associated with both a delivered campaign message and an allowed URL click. Ada's guest object owns comments, belongs to 2 project groups, and has a direct SharePoint assignment that investigators must preserve. The SOC has not yet proved that Ada's credentials were stolen. It must immediately prevent new sign-ins and invalidate existing access, while keeping the object and its resource relationships available for investigation. Which containment sequence best meets the requirements? Option A. Block sign-in for Ada's existing guest account, revoke the account sign-in sessions, and preserve the object, assignments, and audit linkage while the investigation continues. Option B. Reset Ada's redemption status and resend the invitation to the same external address, because redemption reset immediately invalidates every existing access token. Option C. Change the guest's user type from guest to member, and remove the project groups, because user type conversion blocks the external identity provider without changing the object. Option D. Delete and permanently purge the guest, then create a new guest with the same display name, so SharePoint comments and audit events remain attached automatically. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Block sign-in for Ada's existing guest account, revoke the account's sign-in sessions, and preserve the object, assignments, and audit linkage while the investigation continues. Disabling the existing account blocks subsequent authentication, while preserving the guest object's object ID, memberships, assignments, ownership evidence, and audit correlation. Revoking sign-in sessions is the separate containment action that invalidates refresh tokens and forces reauthentication. Because the account is blocked, the guest cannot establish a new session. Deletion would disrupt dependencies and evidence, while invitation redemption and user type describe collaboration or authorization state rather than a complete session containment sequence. The team can make a later recovery, conversion, or deletion decision after validating compromise and resource ownership. For reversible guest containment, preserve the object but close both access paths. Block future sign-in on the user, and revoke existing sessions. Object deletion and redemption reset solve different lifecycle problems. Question 27 of 45. The URL is now attributed in Microsoft Threat Intelligence to infrastructure used by an actor that frequently targets research organizations. A related threat analytics report is available.
Contoso must notify only the threat intelligence team when that report changes, assess its documented tenant impact and recommended actions, and avoid converting every related observable into a block indicator. Which response plan best preserves the required intelligence, tenant evidence, and enforcement boundaries? Option A. Subscribe all users to service health notifications for the actor, and interpret the absence of a service incident as proof that no Contoso identity encountered the infrastructure. Option B. Create a Defender XDR incident manually for the actor. Add every related observable as a high-severity alert, and use incident severity as proof that Contoso was affected. Option C. Subscribe the threat intelligence team to updates for the related threat analytics report. Review tenant impact and recommended action evidence. Validate local sightings before creating a scoped indicator. Option D. Add every domain and IP related to the actor to the tenant allow block list before reviewing threat analytics, because infrastructure attribution proves both maliciousness and tenant exposure. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Subscribe the threat intelligence team to updates for the related threat analytics report. Review tenant impact and recommended action evidence. Validate local sightings before creating a scoped indicator. Threat analytics can send designated recipients email notifications when reports are published or updated. Its report views combine the analyst narrative with tenant-relevant evidence, such as affected assets, related incidents, exposure or protection status, and recommended actions. Infrastructure attribution still does not prove that Contoso encountered every related observable. Local telemetry and the packet's report evidence must support that claim before the team chooses narrowly scoped enforcement. This sequence retains the distinction between tracking updated intelligence, assessing tenant impact, and blocking a validated indicator. A threat analytics update notification tells the right analysts that intelligence changed. The report's tenant impact tabs and local telemetry determine whether Contoso is affected, and only validated evidence justifies enforcement. Question 28 of 45. Contoso uses a third-party platform to run authorized phishing simulations against all employees. The strict preset security policy applies to executives, and standard protection applies to everyone else. Pilot messages are being classified as high-confidence phish before they reach users, and rewritten simulation URLs do not preserve the intended training flow. The security team has the vendor's dedicated sending IP addresses, envelope sender domain, and simulation URLs. It must authorize only this simulation infrastructure without weakening ordinary anti-phishing or safe links protection for either preset policy population. What should the administrator configure? Option A. Configure advanced delivery for a third-party phishing simulation with the vendor sending IPs, envelope domain, and simulation URLs. Validate that path while retaining preset policies. Option B. Add the vendor as a trusted ARC sealer and rely on ARC authentication results to bypass high-confidence phish filtering and URL detonation for simulation messages. Option C. Add the vendor domain to the tenant allow block list as a permanent spoofed sender allow, and disable safe links for all recipients of the standard and strict preset policies. Option D. Create priority zero custom anti-phishing and safe links policies for all employees that allow the vendor domain and exclude every URL in the vendor's parent domain. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Configure advanced delivery for a third-party phishing simulation with the vendor sending IPs, envelope domain, and simulation URLs. Validate that path while retaining preset policies. Advanced delivery has a dedicated third-party phishing simulation path. It uses the supplied sending infrastructure and simulation URLs to identify authorized simulation messages and URLs, so the training flow is not treated like an ordinary attack. This is the narrow exception layer designed to coexist with preset security policies.
The administrator can retain strict and standard protection for normal traffic and validate only the declared vendor path. Broad sender allows URL exclusions or replacement custom policies would enlarge the trust boundary beyond the evidence supplied. ARC validates an intermediary's authentication handling and is not authorization for a phishing simulation. Authorize simulations at the simulation boundary, not at the sender or recipient boundary. Advanced delivery combines sending IP, envelope domain, and simulation URL evidence, while ordinary preset protection remains intact. Question 29 of 45. Fabricam's legal team must send preservation notices to an outside regulator at its existing external SMTP address. The recipient must be selectable from Fabricam's address book and must be added to the legal holds distribution list. The regulator will not sign in, access a site, or receive a Fabricam mailbox or license. Compliance requires the administrator to create only the minimum recipient object and confirm routing with a controlled message before adding it to the production list. Which sequence best meets the requirements? Option A. Invite the regulator as a B2B guest, assign Exchange Online Plan 1, wait for invitation redemption, and then add the guest to legal holds. Option B. Create a mail contact in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center with the regulator's verified external email address, send and trace a controlled test message, and then add that contact to legal holds. Option C. Create an unlicensed member user, set its alternate email to the regulator's address, and add the user to legal holds, because alternate email routes Exchange messages externally. Option D. Create a shared mailbox named for the regulator, license it for external delivery, grant the regulator full access, and configure forwarding to the external address. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Create a mail contact in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center with the regulator's verified external email address. Send and trace a controlled test message, and then add that contact to legal holds. A mail contact is the minimum Exchange recipient for a person outside the organization who must appear in the address book and receive mail at an external address. It has no sign-in identity or mailbox and requires no license, yet it can be added to a distribution list. Creating it with the verified destination, proving delivery with the controlled message and trace, and only then adding it to the production list provides both least privilege and routing evidence. Guest users solve resource collaboration, while user and shared mailbox objects introduce authentication, mailbox, delegation, or licensing dependencies that the scenario excludes. If an outsider needs address book visibility and distribution list mail, but no authentication or tenant mailbox, choose a mail contact. Verify its external routing before introducing it into a production recipient group. Question 30 of 45. A messaging SOC is redesigning Defender alerting without changing anti-spam, safe links, or mail flow enforcement. It must create a custom, low-volume alert that fires only after the same user performs 5 matching activities in 1 hour. Keep portal alerts from an existing noisy custom policy while limiting that policy to 8 notification emails per day, and route notifications from a Microsoft-provided alert policy to a new SOC mailbox without changing the underlying detection. Match each requirement to the alert policy configuration that satisfies it. Each target may be used once. Some targets are not used. Requirements. R1. Aggregate matching activity per user, and alert only when that actor reaches 5 events within 1 hour. R2. Continue creating portal alerts under the existing custom policy, but stop sending notification email after 8 messages in a day. R3. Send notifications from the existing Microsoft-provided alert policy to socialerts@contoso.com without redesigning its detection logic. Targets. T1. Set the custom policy's activity threshold to 8 per day. T2.
Create a custom alert policy with a threshold of 5, a 1-hour window, and user-based aggregation. T3. Edit the default alert policy's recipient settings to include soch alerts at contoso.com. T4. Modify the outbound spam policy notification settings instead of the Defender alert policy. T5. Set the existing policy's daily email notification limit to 8 while leaving its trigger conditions enabled. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T2, aggregate matching activity per user, and alert only when that actor reaches 5 events within 1 hour. Maps to create a custom alert policy with a threshold of 5, a 1-hour window, and user-based aggregation. R2 maps to T5. Continue creating portal alerts under the existing custom policy, but stop sending notification email after 8 messages in a day. Maps to set the existing policy's daily email notification limit to 8 while leaving its trigger conditions enabled. R3 maps to T3. Send notifications from the existing Microsoft-provided alert policy to soch alerts at contoso.com without redesigning its detection logic. Maps to edit the default alert policy's recipient settings to include soch alerts at contoso.com. A custom alert policy defines the monitored activity, scope, threshold, aggregation unit, and time window. So user-based aggregation at 5 events in 1 hour satisfies the first detection requirement. The daily email notification limit caps messages sent by a policy without stopping its portal alerts or changing its activity trigger, which preserves the second evidence stream. Microsoft-provided default alert policies have fixed detection logic, but eligible recipient settings can be changed, so the SOC mailbox belongs in that policy's notification configuration. None of these monitoring changes requires altering the separate email protection policies that enforce message handling. Dissect an alert policy into 3 independent layers. Trigger and aggregation decide when a portal alert exists. The daily email limit caps only notification volume. And recipient settings decide who hears about an unchanged default detection. Question 31 of 45. Contoso runs active and staging Connect Sync servers. Connect Health notifications currently go to all global administrators, but only identity operations should receive alert generation and resolution email. Auditors need read-only Connect Health history without email or synchronization authority. Which plan meets the requirements without changing either server? Option A. Keep notification delivery to all hybrid identity administrators, add the auditors to that role, and use Microsoft 365 Service Health email preferences to remove the implementation team. Option B. Promote the staging server to active so Connect Health recalculates recipients, and grant auditors directory synchronization accounts so they can review alert history. Option C. In Connect Health, clear notification to all global administrators, add the identity operations address, and assign auditors Connect Health Reader at the required service scope. Then validate access and notification delivery. Option D. Disable the Connect Health agent on the staging server to suppress duplicate mail. Then create an Azure Monitor action group for the identity operations address and assign auditors Global Reader. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. In Connect Health, clear notification to all global administrators, add the identity operations address, and assign auditors Connect Health Reader at the required service scope. Then validate access and notification delivery. Connect Health separates native alert recipients from Azure RBAC access to health data, clearing the All Global Administrators option and adding the operations address narrows alert generation and resolution email. Connect Health Reader at the required service scope gives auditors read-only access without synchronization authority or notification membership. Neither change alters the active or staging server. For Connect Health, separate who is monitored, who can read the portal, and who receives alert mail. Keep every required server monitored, use a reporting role for evidence access, and narrow native notification recipients independently. Question 32 of 45. A user reports a message as phishing after opening its attachment. Defender for Office 365 shows that the attachment was detonated as clean at delivery, but the attachment hash is now malicious. The SOC must preserve the reported message record, determine every recipient and current delivery location for the same campaign, inspect the email and attachment entities before choosing scope, and remove only delivered copies. Policy changes and tenant-wide sender or URL blocks require a separate change review. The responder has search and purge permission and must retain auditable remediation status. Which investigation and response sequence best meets the requirements? Option A. Add the sender and attachment hash to the tenant allow block list first. Wait for policy propagation and close the user-reported item because the block proves all delivered copies were deleted. Option B. Pivot from the reported item through entity and campaign evidence. Verify delivered copies in Threat Explorer. Soft delete the result set and track the action. Option C. Use the aggregate threat protection status report to estimate the number delivered. Delete the reported user's copy from Outlook and treat the report total as Action Center completion evidence. Option D. Start an attack simulation that reuses the attachment. Use simulation failures as the campaign recipient list, and hard delete every message from the sender without reviewing delivery locations. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Pivot from the reported item through entity and campaign evidence, verify delivered copies in Threat Explorer, soft delete the result set, and track the action. The user-reported item preserves the submission and provides a starting point for the email entity. Entity and campaign pivots establish the related message, attachment, verdict, and campaign context, while Threat Explorer supplies the recipient level and delivery location evidence needed to define the actual mailbox result set. Because the responder has search and purge permission, a soft delete action can remove the verified delivered copies while keeping them recoverable during the incident, and Action Center records remediation progress and outcome. This sequence deliberately separates investigation, scope, mailbox remediation, and later policy governance. Blocking an indicator affects future handling, but does not remove existing copies. Simulation data is synthetic, and an aggregate report or one Outlook deletion cannot prove tenant-wide disposition. In a user-reported email investigation, preserve the submission, pivot through entities to establish campaign context, use Explore to prove mailbox scope, and let Action Center, not a policy block or aggregate chart, prove remediation. Question 33 of 45. An employee departure mailbox must become a shared investigations mailbox without changing its SMTP address or losing its existing content. The mailbox is 72 gigabytes, has an online archive, and is on hold. Investigators need full access, but must not send as the former employee. Identity operations must block interactive sign-in immediately. Finance wants to remove the departing user's license as soon as doing so will not violate mailbox capacity, archive, or hold dependencies. Which sequence best satisfies continuity, least privilege, and licensing requirements? Option A. Block sign-in, convert the existing mailbox to shared, grant full access only, retain the required exchange license while size, archive, or hold requires it, and remove the license only when those dependencies no longer apply. Option B. Remove the license first to stop sign-in. Convert the disconnected mailbox to a Microsoft 365 group and add investigators as group owners, so the archive and hold transfer automatically. Option C. Convert the mailbox to shared, remove every license immediately because all shared mailboxes are license exempt, and grant full access plus send on behalf to preserve the original sender identity. Option D. Delete the user, create a new unlicensed shared mailbox with the same SMTP address, restore the content into it, and grant investigators send as so they can verify access. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Block sign-in, convert the existing mailbox to shared, grant full access only, retain the required exchange license while size, archive, or hold requires it, and remove the license only when those dependencies no longer apply. Blocking sign-in and replacing credentials contain the identity without deleting the directory object on which mailbox conversion depends. Converting the existing mailbox preserves its SMTP identity and content. Full access supplies the required ability to open and manage the mailbox, but does not grant send as or send on behalf, so it honors the no send requirement. An unlicensed shared mailbox is ordinarily limited to 50 gigabytes, and advanced requirements, such as an online archive or hold, can require licensing. Therefore, conversion alone is not evidence that the license can be removed. Retaining the appropriate license until size and feature dependencies are removed preserves service continuity and compliance. Deleting or disconnecting first, changing the recipient into a Microsoft 365 group, or adding sender permissions introduces avoidable identity, data, and authorization risk. For a departure mailbox, solve 4 boundaries in order: contain sign-in, convert the existing recipient, grant mailbox access separately from sender rights, and remove licensing only after size and compliance feature dependencies permit it. Question 34 of 45. Contoso assigns Microsoft 365 E5 through a security group. 12 new direct members appear under Errors and Issues because an inherited license from another group enables a service plan that conflicts with the E5 bundle. Capacity and membership are healthy, and audit policy forbids masking the group error with direct assignment. What should the license administrator do? Option A. Correct the conflicting group service plan bundle, reprocess the affected users, and verify that the intended group remains the assignment source. Option B. Assign E5 directly to the 12 users and leave both conflicting group assignments unchanged. Option C. Increase the E5 seat pool and restart Microsoft Entra Connect Sync to clear the cloud license conflict. Option D. Recreate the licensing security group as a Microsoft 365 group so conflicting service plans are ignored. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Correct the conflicting group service plan bundle, reprocess the affected users, and verify that the intended group remains the assignment source. Errors and Issues identifies incompatible service plans inherited from different group license assignments. Correct the appropriate group bundle, reprocess affected users, and verify that the error clears while the intended indirect assignment remains authoritative. Direct assignment can mask the defect. Changing group type doesn't resolve incompatible plans, and neither added capacity nor Connect Sync repairs cloud license plan conflicts. Treat group license errors as dependency evidence. Correct the conflicting inherited plan at its group source, then verify the user's indirect assignment instead of masking it with a direct license. Question 35 of 45. Contoso uses Connect Sync for its corporate forest and Cloud Sync for a separate factory forest. After separate directory changes, one corporate user is unexpectedly filtered and a factory user fails with an attribute validation error. The corporate Connect Sync server completes its cycle, and the factory agent remains healthy. Administrators must prove the effective scope and attribute transformation for each single user before changing production rules or starting a broad synchronization cycle. The two investigations are independent and may be performed in either order. Which two actions should the administrators take? Choose two. Option A. Reinstall every Cloud Sync agent because an object-level attribute validation failure proves that the agent group cannot communicate with Microsoft Entra ID. Option B. Switch the Connect Sync staging server to active before examining the corporate object, so a second exporter can reveal which inbound rule should win. Option C. For the factory user, correct the source attribute named by its Cloud Sync log failure and validate it with on-demand provisioning. Option D. For the corporate user, run Connect Sync Preview with full synchronization to inspect scope, join/projection, and attribute flow without export.
Option E. Edit both cloud user objects directly and run an initial synchronization for both forests, because cloud-side values override source scope and transformation rules for synchronized identities. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and D. Option C. For the factory user, correct the source attribute named by its Cloud Sync log failure and validate it with on-demand provisioning. Option D. For the corporate user, run Connect Sync Preview with full synchronization to inspect scope, join/projection, and attribute flow without export. Connect Sync Preview evaluates one connector space object against the selected synchronization path and exposes scoping, join or projection, and attribute flow detail without exporting the preview itself. That is the narrow evidence needed for an unexpectedly filtered corporate object before a production rule edit. Cloud Sync provisioning logs identify the failed step and source data problem for the factory object. After correcting the authoritative directory value, on-demand provisioning provides a single object validation of scope and transformation without waiting for or forcing a broad cycle. The actions are independent and unordered because each remains inside its engine's diagnostic model. Activating a second Connect Sync exporter risks conflicting exports. A healthy Cloud Sync agent disproves a blanket transport diagnosis. And cloud-side edits do not replace authoritative source correction for synchronized attributes. Troubleshoot each sync engine with its own single object microscope. Connect Sync Preview proves rule scope and flow without export, while Cloud Sync provisioning logs plus on-demand provisioning prove the failing source value and its correction. Question 36 of 45. Replace current members of a dynamic Microsoft 365 group named Sales with current members of a dynamic Microsoft 365 group named Sales. Option A. Create a simulation automation using approved technique and payloads. Target the dynamic sales group, exclude emergency accounts, select target all selected users in every simulation run, schedule 6 monthly runs, and assign outcome-based training. Option B. Create one ordinary simulation with a 6-month completion date. Configure monthly training reminders and use reminder delivery as evidence that the phishing payload was resent each month. Option C. Create one training campaign for the sales organization. Schedule monthly reminder notifications and interpret incomplete training as a credential harvest failure for each month. Option D. Create an advanced delivery phishing simulation entry for the sales organization and rotate its simulation URLs monthly because advanced delivery creates the payload runs and participant training reports. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. Create a simulation automation using approved technique and payloads. Target the dynamic sales group. Exclude emergency accounts. Select target all selected users in every simulation run. Schedule 6 monthly runs, and assign outcome-based training. Simulation automation creates independently reportable, recurring exercises. The dynamic Microsoft 365 group reevaluates sales membership, while target all selected users in every simulation run prevents the default distribution of selected users across runs. The automation can apply approved payloads, exclusions, schedule, and outcome-based training without changing mail protection or manually cloning simulations. Separate recurring exercise orchestration from its adjacent controls. Simulation automation creates scheduled, independently reportable runs. Training campaigns teach without a lure, and advanced delivery only permits declared simulation traffic through protection. Question 37 of 45. A certificate-authenticated Microsoft Graph PowerShell runbook must create 900 cloud-only member users from an approved HR file, and then assign each user a Microsoft 365 license. Every row contains a unique user principal name, usage location, initial password profile, and requested SKU. The runbook must not manage groups or applications. A user must never receive a license before creation and usage location assignment succeed, and one malformed row or failed license assignment must not prevent later users from being processed. Audit requires the created object ID plus the result of each dependent operation for every row. Which runbook design best satisfies the dependency, least privilege, and evidence requirements?
Option A. Grant group readWrite.all. Create a group for each SKU. Add every requested user principal name before the users exist, and infer successful user creation from eventual group-based license assignment. Option B. Grant user.create and license assignment.readWrite.all. For each row, create the user with usage location, capture its ID, assign the license, and log each result before continuing. Option C. Grant user.read.all. Use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center bulk create CSV as an unattended graph request and retry the complete 900-row file whenever any license assignment fails. Option D. Grant directory.readWriteAll. Submit all user creations and license assignments as unrelated parallel requests, and use the PowerShell process exit code as the result for the file.
Lock in your answer.
The correct answer is B. Grant user.create and licenseassignment.readWrite.all. For each row, create the user with usage location, capture its ID, assign the license, and log each result before continuing. The runbook has a per-user dependency chain. Create the user with required properties such as usage location, preserve the returned immutable object ID, and only then invoke license assignment for that object. For app-only access, user.create is the least privileged permission for creating users, and licenseassignment.readWriteAll is the least privileged permission for assigning licenses. Using both avoids directory-wide, group, or application write authority. Recording each operation independently preserves evidence and permits later rows to continue when one row fails. File-level success, speculative group membership, and unsequenced parallel calls all lose either dependency integrity or per-object proof. For a bulk workflow with dependent rights, make each row a small auditable transaction, narrow object permission, create with prerequisites, capture the immutable ID, perform the dependent write, and record each result without aborting unrelated rows. Question 38 of 45. Contoso will use Microsoft Entra Certificate-Based Authentication, CBA, for privileged administrators. Certificates issued under the Privileged Admin Policy, OID, by the corporate issuing CA must satisfy a conditional access authentication strength as phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. Certificates from the same CA that contain only the standard user policy OID may remain usable for ordinary CBA sign-in, but must not satisfy the privileged strength. The security team must bind trust to certificate evidence rather than to a user's group membership alone, and must validate the pilot before enforcement. Which configuration sequence meets the requirement? Option A. Create a custom authentication strength containing password plus SMS, then and the privileged admin policy OID as a user filter, because authentication strengths inspect directory attributes rather than certificate bindings. Option B. Enable CBA for all users. Map every certificate from the corporate CA to high affinity by issuer alone, and use a named location to distinguish privileged from standard certificates during conditional access evaluation. Option C. Configure the privileged admin policy OID only as a username binding rule. Require the built-in multi-factor authentication strength and treat successful certificate-to-user mapping as proof that the certificate has high authentication strength. Option D. Enable CBA for the pilot. Trust the CA. Map the privileged admin policy OID to multi-factor high-affinity CBA. Require that certificate evidence in a custom authentication strength. Test the scoped policy in report-only mode before enabling it. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D. Enable CBA for the pilot. Trust the CA. Map the privileged admin policy OID to multi-factor high-affinity CBA.
Require that certificate evidence in a custom authentication strength. Test the scoped policy in report-only mode before enabling it. CBA separates certificate trust and user binding from authentication strength classification. The tenant trusts the issuing CA, while authentication binding rules can use certificate issuer or policy OID evidence to assign an authentication protection level. Mapping only the privileged admin policy OID to high affinity lets those certificates satisfy multi-factor CBA in an authentication strength without elevating standard certificates from the same issuer. The custom strength is then consumed by a scoped conditional access policy, and report-only evaluation provides impact evidence before enforcement. Username binding establishes which account the certificate represents. It does not by itself classify the method as high affinity. In Entr CBA, solve 3 boundaries in order. Trust the issuer, bind certificate evidence, such as a policy OID, to an authentication protection level, then require the corresponding CBA method through a conditional access authentication strength. Question 39 of 45. Contoso publishes the same approved sensitivity label catalog through 2 label policies. The broad workforce baseline policy makes internal the default label and does not require users to justify a downgrade. A narrower mergers policy targets the deal team, makes confidential the default, and requires justification when a user removes the label or selects a lower classification. Pilot deal team users receive all expected labels, but still get the internal default and no downgrade prompt. Audit confirms that both policies apply, and the team must preserve one common label taxonomy, rather than duplicate labels for mergers. What should the compliance administrator change? Option A. Remove the deal team from workforce baseline, because a user cannot receive labels from more than one sensitivity label policy, and policy settings are merged only when scopes are disjoint. Option B. Move the mergers policy above workforce baseline in sensitivity label policy priority. Allow policy distribution to complete, and retest a targeted user while keeping the shared labels and both scopes unchanged. Option C. Move the confidential label above internal in the global label order, because label order determines which overlapping policy supplies default label and justification settings. Option D. Clone every label for the mergers policy and give the clones higher label priority, because policy priority affects publication only and cannot resolve conflicting user policy settings. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is B. Move the mergers policy above workforce baseline in sensitivity label policy priority. Allow policy distribution to complete, and retest a targeted user while keeping the shared labels and both scopes unchanged. Users can be included in multiple sensitivity label policies and receive the union of labels published to them. When user policy settings conflict, policy priority determines which policy settings take precedence. Raising the narrower mergers policy above the baseline therefore supplies its confidential default and downgrade justification requirement to overlapping users, while preserving the common label objects and broad baseline coverage. Global label order expresses classification order and is important for identifying upgrades and downgrades, but it does not choose which policy supplies a conflicting default label setting. Do not confuse label order with policy priority. Label order defines classification relationships, while the highest priority applicable label policy supplies conflicting user settings. Published label availability can still be cumulative. Contoso synchronizes workforce identities from Active Directory domain services by using Microsoft Entra Connect Sync with password hash synchronization. Microsoft Entra Password Protection DC agents run on every writable domain controller, and 2 registered proxy servers provide policy updates. During recovery from a credential theft incident, the identity team is piloting self-service recovery for a group of synchronized users. Investigators must preserve sign-in and reset evidence while the pilot proceeds. Question 40 of 45. Pilot users sometimes become locked out of ADDs after repeated attempts with an old password.
Contoso wants a verified pilot user to unlock the on-premises account through SSPR without being forced to choose a new password. An unlock must be written to ADDs rather than changing only cloud state, and the existing SSPR pilot scope must remain unchanged. Which two configurations are required? Choose two. Option A. Assign the pilot users the authentication administrator role so their self-service unlocks are authorized against ADDS. Option B. Change the tenant authentication method from password hash synchronization to pass-through authentication so cloud verification can clear the ADDS lockout. Option C. Enable the SSPR option that allows users to unlock accounts without resetting their passwords. Option D. Enable password hash synchronization rollback so Microsoft Entra ID can overwrite the ADDS lockout time attribute after the next synchronization cycle. Option E. Enable password writeback in Microsoft Entra Connect Sync and enable the corresponding on-premises integration option for SSPR. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are C and E. Option C. Enable the SSPR option that allows users to unlock accounts without resetting their passwords. Option E. Enable password writeback in Microsoft Entra Connect Sync and enable the corresponding on-premises integration option for SSPR. An on-premises account unlock initiated through SSPR requires the writeback path. Password writeback must be enabled in Microsoft Entra Connect Sync and enabled for SSPR in Microsoft Entra ID. Contoso must also explicitly allow users to unlock accounts without resetting their passwords. These two selections are complementary and unordered. One provides the cloud to ADDS writeback dependency, and the other permits the requested unlock-only operation. Neither the tenant's sign-in authentication method nor password hash synchronization writes an account unlock state back to ADDS, and self-service users do not need an administrative role. For a synchronized user's SSPR unlock-only requirement, separate permission to perform the operation from the transport that commits it. Enable unlock without reset, and provide the Connect Sync writeback path to ADDS. Question 41 of 45. Security adds a credential theft campaign term to the custom banned password list. After both proxy servers retrieve the revised policy and DC agent event logs confirm enforcement, investigators find that a pilot user can still sign in with an existing password containing that term. No password change or reset has occurred for that user since the policy update. Contoso must eliminate the exposed password without misdiagnosing healthy password protection components. Which response correctly applies the password protection boundary and the required sequence? Option A. After verifying policy arrival at the DC agents, require a controlled password change or reset. Password protection evaluates the new candidate, not existing passwords retroactively. Option B. Wait for the next password hash synchronization cycle because it retroactively compares every synchronized password with the custom banned list and disables matching users. Option C. Reinstall every DC agent because a custom banned term must immediately invalidate all existing ADDS passwords when the proxy downloads the policy. Option D. Remove the campaign term from the custom list and create a conditional access named location block, because password protection can evaluate custom terms only for cloud-only users. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is A. After verifying policy arrival at the DC agents, require a controlled password change or reset. Password protection evaluates the new candidate, not existing passwords retroactively. Microsoft Entra Password Protection evaluates a candidate password when a user changes or resets a password. Publishing a new banned term does not scan and invalidate passwords that are already in use. The healthy policy download and DC agent evidence therefore does not indicate a deployment failure. Contoso should first establish that the revised policy is available at the enforcement points, then use a controlled change or reset to replace the exposed password.
The new candidate is evaluated against the global and custom banned password policy. Password hash synchronization does not perform a retroactive banned password audit, and conditional access location controls address sign-in conditions rather than password vocabulary.
A healthy banned password policy is an enforcement rule for the next password set operation, not a retroactive credential scanner. Verify policy arrival, then deliberately drive a change or reset for the exposed account. Question 42 of 45. The affected user completes the controlled reset and then signs in interactively to Teams. Minutes later, Teams reports that it cannot refresh Exchange calendar data. The help desk searches only the user's interactive sign-ins, sees the successful Teams event, and proposes another reset. Investigators must identify the failing token request and any conditional access result before changing credentials again. What should the identity engineer examine next? Option A, the password protection DC agent operational log. Because every cloud token refresh failure after an SSPR reset is evaluated by a writable domain controller as a new password change request. Option B, only the successful interactive Teams sign-ins device detail, because a Teams client cannot perform a separate non-interactive token acquisition for Exchange Online. Option C, the Microsoft 365 Service Health Dashboard. And if no advisory exists, immediately delete all of the user's registered authentication methods. Option D, the user's non-interactive sign-in records for the incident time and Exchange Online resource, including the status, failure details, authentication details, conditional access result, and correlation identifier. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is D, the user's non-interactive sign-in records for the incident time and Exchange Online resource, including the status, failure details, authentication details, conditional access result, and correlation identifier. A rich client can obtain or refresh tokens in the background for a resource that differs from the resource named in the visible interactive sign-in. Microsoft Entra separates interactive and non-interactive user sign-ins. The engineer should therefore align the incident time and Exchange Online resource with the non-interactive record, then use its failure, authentication, and conditional access details and correlation identifier to locate the actual denial. The successful Teams event proves only that one interactive request succeeded. Password protection logs password set operations, not ordinary token refreshes, and destructive method deletion before examining the relevant sign-in evidence discards state without establishing cause. When a client shell succeeds, but a background workload fails, pivot by interaction type and resource, not merely by user. Inspect non-interactive sign-ins for the downstream resource before altering credentials or methods. Question 43 of 45. Fabricam plans automatic remediation for high-risk synchronized workforce users. The intended conditional access user risk policy will require a secure password change, but a pilot user can change the cloud password without updating ADDS, and then continues using the old password on premises. Several other pilot users have not registered enough authentication information to complete self-service remediation. 2 monitored emergency access accounts must remain outside risk-based enforcement, and the identity team needs predicted policy impact before activation. Which plan establishes the required dependencies and rollout evidence? Option A. Dismiss all current risky users before enabling a block policy. Exclude synchronized identities from identity protection, and rely on Microsoft Entra Connect password hash synchronization to send future cloud password changes to ADDS. Option B. Create a sign-in risk policy that requires MFA because successful MFA dismisses persistent user risk and writes the user's cloud password back to ADDS without SSPR configuration. Option C. Validate target user SSPR registration and password write-back first. Then configure the high user risk policy to require password change, exclude emergency accounts,
review report-only results, and enable it. Option D. Enable the high user risk policy immediately with require password change. Then deploy SSPR registration and password writeback only for users who are blocked during remediation. Lock in your answer. The correct answer is C. Validate target user SSPR registration and password writeback first. Then configure the high user risk policy to require password change, exclude emergency accounts, review report-only results, and enable it. Secure user risk remediation depends on a working SSPR experience. Target users must be able to satisfy the registration and authentication requirements, and synchronized users need password writeback when the remediated password must become authoritative in ADDS. Those dependencies should be validated before a conditional access policy requires password change. Excluding monitored emergency accounts protects recovery access, while report-only mode supplies projected policy results without enforcing the new control. Password hash synchronization normally carries password hashes from ADDS to Microsoft Entra ID. It is not the cloud to ADDS write-back path. A user risk password change control is the end of a dependency chain, not the beginning. Establish SSPR registration and hybrid writeback. Preserve emergency access, observe report-only impact, and only then enforce remediation. Question 44 of 45. Fabricam is separating joiner administration across Microsoft 365. A provisioning team must assign and remove product licenses for existing users and groups. The same team must create and manage Exchange Online recipients, including shared mailboxes, but must not create or delete Microsoft Entra users, assign directory roles, or administer Exchange transport and organization-wide settings. Privileged identity management will make the required roles eligible. Which two built-in roles should Fabricam use to meet the workload requirements with least privilege? Choose two. Option A, License Administrator. Option B, User Administrator. Option C, Exchange Recipient Administrator. Option D, Privileged Role Administrator. Option E, Exchange Administrator. Lock in your answer. The correct answers are A and C. Option A, License Administrator. Option C, Exchange Recipient Administrator. License Administrator supplies the product license management plane for users and groups without granting general user lifecycle or password reset authority. Exchange Recipient Administrator supplies recipient management capabilities, including mailbox and recipient work, without the broader Exchange organization and transport authority of Exchange Administrator. The selections are unordered because each covers a separate workload boundary. User Administrator and Exchange Administrator could cover nearby requirements, but exceed the stated scope. Privileged Role Administrator governs role assignment and PIM, rather than performing license or recipient operations. Decompose a mixed Microsoft 365 job by control plane. License assignment and Exchange recipient administration can be delegated independently, so choose the narrow role in each plane instead of one broad identity or workload administrator. Question 45 of 45. Contoso is investigating 3 outbound mail failures after a credential theft campaign. 1 compromised mailbox and 1 compromised inbound connector appear on the Restricted Entities page. A third mailbox returns error 5.1.8, but its address does not appear on that page. Exchange Online PowerShell confirms the address in the blocked sender list. Responders must remediate each compromise before removing the applicable service-enforced block, and must preserve the entity boundary in their evidence. Match each finding to the response that removes the applicable block after remediation. Each target may be used once. Some targets are not used. Requirements. R1. The mailbox is a restricted user on the Restricted Entities page after sending spam with the stolen credentials. R2. The connector is a restricted entity after attackers used its configuration to relay malicious mail. R3. The mailbox is absent from restricted entities, but getBlockedSenderAddress returns its sender address. Targets. T1. Delete the outbound spam policy that detected the activity, so every entity restricted by that policy is released. T2. Remove the address from the tenant allow/block list and make no change to restricted entity or blocked sender state. T3. After securing the account and validating the cause, unblock the user from the restricted entities page or use the documented restricted user PowerShell removal. T4. After securing the connector and correcting its source restrictions or credentials, use the restricted entities workflow for removing a blocked connector. T5. After securing the account and validating the cause, run remove blocked sender address for the confirmed sender address. Lock in your answer. The complete correct mapping is R1 maps to T3. The mailbox is a restricted user on the restricted entities page after sending spam with stolen credentials. Maps to, after securing the account and validating the cause, unblock the user from the restricted entities page, or use the documented restricted user PowerShell removal. R2 maps to T4. The connector is a restricted entity after attackers used its configuration to relay malicious mail. Maps to, after securing the connector and correcting its source restrictions or credentials, use the restricted entities workflow for removing a blocked connector. R3 maps to T5. The mailbox is absent from restricted entities, but getBlockSenderAddress returns its sender address. Maps to, after securing the account and validating the cause, run removeBlockSenderAddress for the confirmed sender address. Restricted entities can be user accounts or connectors, but the removal workflow must match the entity type and follow remediation. A restricted mailbox is secured and then unblocked through the restricted entity's user workflow, or its documented PowerShell equivalent. A block connector requires connector investigation, correction of the compromised configuration, and the block connector removal workflow. A sender address returned by getBlockSenderAddress is a separate address scope state. After remediation, removeBlockSenderAddress removes that block. The tenant allow block list is a different control plane, and deleting an outbound spam policy neither establishes remediation nor provides an entity-scoped release. Treat blocked from sending as a symptom, not a single object. Bind the evidence to a restricted user, restricted connector, or blocked sender address. Remediate first, and then use the removal operation for that exact entity scope. You finished MS-102 Set 4. Treat every miss as evidence. Group misses by service boundary, identify the constraint you overlooked, and answer again from the requirement. That practice builds Microsoft 365 administrator judgment. Thanks for practicing with WebLizard Cert Lab. You completed MS-102 Practice Exam Set 4. Review the full exam clues, revisit weak objectives, and repeat the decisions you missed until you can explain every service boundary without guessing.